All right. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. We are recording today's webinar, so we will make the recording available later. We're going to have Jesse in a moment do a presentation, and then at the end we'll have time for Q&A. So thank you for joining us, and without further ado, here is our host, Jesse Glick.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Continuous Delivery as Code with Jenkins Workflow. I'm a developer at CloudBees, and I work on a number of things related to Jenkins and specifically workflow. So just to start things off, I'd like to talk about Jenkins Workflow as code and what we mean by this notion of as code. So just very briefly to get people started, Workflow is a set of Jenkins plugins which went into the first 1.0 release at the end of last year, and we've had a number of releases since then. The basic set of problems that Workflow tries to solve in Jenkins is often has to do with people who have complex build, test, and deploy pipelines. So this sort of falls under the category of what we call continuous delivery. You have a number of different stages that you need to perform, starting with source code typically and moving on through builds, tests, deployments. Trying to do all of these stages in traditional Jenkins projects, which were designed really for a more limited set of tasks around continuous integration, is possible, but it sometimes becomes difficult when your systems get a little bit more complex and you need some kind of custom logic. So Workflow is created to fill this gap. It's possible to have different stages of a flow. You can incorporate human input, run certain portions in parallel, and have a rich logical structure to your process. Another important advantage is that if you do have build steps which run for hours or even days, that those can survive restarts of Jenkins or disconnections of the Jenkins slave agent from the master. But what we really want to focus on today is a different aspect of Workflow, which is that the Workflow definition is a script. It's written in the Groovy programming language, so it's sort of a superset of Java. And the script orchestrates the build as a whole and essentially defines what services you need from Jenkins. So the script would ask Jenkins for a slave to run build steps on. It would inform Jenkins about test results so that those can be displayed in a visual graph and so on. It'll call into your own build tools, make, ant, maven, rake, gradle, and any other scripts you might have in various languages for all of the details of the particular build steps that sort of performing the higher level orchestration. So what's interesting for us today is that this Workflow script can be versioned with your project in your own version control system. And that opens up a lot of nice possibilities, leading us towards a vision of what we call continuous delivery as code. And that means that everything that you need to define how your project is built is kept alongside your own source code. You can subject it to code review, you can branch it, you can merge it, all of the things you normally do with source code. And the flip side of that is it means that there's less configuration in the Jenkins home directory. So Jenkins itself actually has a slimmer definition of what your development system is like. Most of the interesting details are kept in your own source control. So in order to achieve this, there are a number of particular features that we want to bring together. And these have been developed throughout this year. And I'd like to show a set of those in combination so that you can see how these things all work together. So first of all, I'll talk about Docker. So Docker's the container system, currently for Linux, that lets you run particular processes in a well-defined, isolated environment, a lightweight container. So there's a workflow plugin for Docker, which provides a simple entry point to different things that you might want to do with Docker. And some of the obvious things that you might do relate to projects which actually use Docker for deployment. So projects which ultimately are creating a Docker image and are launching containers. So you can build Docker images from a Dockerfile source description. You can test them, and you can publish them in various registries and so on. Today we're going to be focusing on something a little bit different, which is more broadly applicable. Even if your project doesn't actually use Docker for any part of deployment, it turns out that it's a really useful tool for isolating build environments for continuous integration and deployment. So using the same plugin, you can run any build steps you want inside of a Docker container that you specify. You can pick up a standard image, or you can actually build a customized image, which means essentially a complete virtual Linux computer from your source code if you want to. And the advantage of this is that the Jenkins slaves, the build computers that are doing all of the work, can be very generic. So you can simply have your Jenkins master hooked up to a large pool of high-speed but completely generic Linux slaves. Basically, the only thing that they need to have is the ability to connect to a standard Docker server. And at that point, all of the definition of how your particular project is built can be part of the workflow script. So here at the bottom of the screen, I'm showing an example of how we select a particular version, 3.3.3, of the Maven build tool, running on top of Java version 8. So this image happens to be on Docker Hub, the public hosting service for Docker images. I didn't need to customize it. I simply select that particular image, so that encodes all of the details of my build environment. And then I just want to say, I want to run a shell step, so I want to run mvn, that's a Maven command, and run some Maven command there. And I know that when I run mvn, it's going to be running Maven 3.3. So that's entirely under the control of the job, this workflow script. If I have some sort of build failure, I don't have to guess what tools Jenkins is using to run my build, because I can actually load that exact same Docker image on my laptop and run and play with the build in that environment locally before I send a new commit. And so this really empowers the developer of the project to use the best possible tools for a particular project. If you wanted to change this to be Maven 3.2.3 for some reason because you found an incompatibility in Maven 3.3.3, you just change that in your script. That's all you have to do. So you don't need to go and pester a Jenkins administrator or say, hey, could you please install a different version of Maven on such and such a slave and let me know when you're done, and try to figure out how to refer to the right path for that tool. None of those problems exist here. Now, another feature that I'd like to show is custom DSLs. So this stands for domain-specific language. So one of the things that Groovy is good at is that it makes it possible to provide a very, very short syntax for certain commonly used things. So there's long been a special Git repository hosted by Jenkins called Workflow Libs. And this is a place that you can put definitions of components of workflow builds that should apply over the entire site. So originally it had an SRC or sources directory. And this was a place where you could define Groovy classes that could be imported into your script. So if you wanted to create various utility classes or model objects, that sort of thing, you could do that. Now there's a new subdirectory, which is called vars for variables. And here you can put special scripts which essentially define new global variables. So these are identifiers that become available to any workflow script running on the system. And this allows you to create a new entry point to a whole subsystem that you define. So the Docker Workflow plugin, for example, adds a new global variable called Docker. And that is the starting point for all of the Docker-related functionality. This new system with the var subdirectory allows you to create your own entry points very similar to that. So your Jenkins installation can demonstrate, it can use particular features that make sense for your development process. And one special thing you can do with this is that if you define a call method, then you're actually creating a function, and rather than what looks like a variable. So this lets you essentially make things that look like workflow steps, but you get to define them yourself. And one special variant of a call method, which we're going to demonstrate today, is what's called a builder pattern, where you wind up with something that looks less like a method call and more like a configuration file. All right, so now I'm going to talk about probably the most important feature here, which is the ability to build multiple branches of source control cleanly. So there's long been a problem in Jenkins that there is no straightforward way to create one project that would handle a lot of different source control branches at once. So one of the workarounds that people tend to use is to use branch wildcards for some systems, especially Git. You can see an example of how this is working on the left-hand side here with the build history. The problem is that the build history becomes very confused here. So build number 3066 was off of the master branch, so this was a production build, and that looks blue, so that's okay. But then after that, it looks like there were 3 different pull requests, basically branches, that various people built against this job. And some of them are good, and they wound up with a blue ball, and some of them had some failures. They didn't compile, or they had some test failures. But these are all mixed together in a long list without any immediate way to see which is which. So what is the status of my master branch? And if you try to use something like the build status icon, then it gets confused by a branch that's failing, even though master is fine, and so on. So it's sort of a mess. It's also not possible this way to adjust the build steps according to the branch you're using. So some people create a separate project per branch, so that solves those problems, but then you have a bunch of different Jenkins projects, and this becomes a maintenance burden. So then they try to add in extra tools to script the creation of different projects for each branch, and so then they have to maintain these extra tools as well and have a learning curve for that. So this is a very widespread problem that we really want to solve. So the solution with workflow is something called multi-branch workflow. And the idea here is that your workflow script you write into a file called Jenkinsfile. So this is a conventional file name, just like Makefile or Rakefile or Dockerfile. And any branch in your repository that contains a Jenkins file is assumed to be buildable. So, and from within the Jenkins file, you don't have to repeat the location of the source control system that held it. You just write checkout SCM, and that knows the proper, kind of SCM like Git, and knows the URL, the credentials, everything. So if you want, excuse me, if you want to make changes to how your build script works, you just edit your Jenkins file. You can make a per branch edit, and once those get merged or rejected, then the job definition accordingly gets updated. And the particular version of the Jenkins file that gets loaded is always going to match the version of other sources that you have in your checkout SCM step. So we'll see an example of that. So then how do you find the different branches that are available? So there's a generic inspection of source control repositories that's available for Git, Subversion, and Mercurial currently. It can be extended to other Jenkins source control plugins. And we're also building a dedicated GitHub support that replaces the generic Git integration for the case of people hosting their code on GitHub. So you get some advantages. For example, it can use the GitHub REST API to find your branches more quickly without actually having to keep a local copy. And it can use Git webhooks so it gets notified immediately if changes happen on GitHub. You don't have to set Jenkins to poll every 30 minutes to look for changes. In the CloudBees Jenkins platform, so my employer's proprietary extensions to Jenkins, we're adding some additional branch sources and branch source features. So to flesh out the GitHub support, we're adding support for building pull requests, which I'll be demonstrating today, as well as commit status notification. This is what tells GitHub whether your commits are good or bad. We're also building BitBucket integration. So this is a Git and Mercurial hosting service. And we're looking into other integrations as well. Stash, another Git hosting service. Garrett-based code review and validated merge. This is a CloudBees extended feature for letting people push proposed commits without having to even create a branch and have Jenkins validate them before they're pushed upstream. So using multi-branch system means that rather than creating a project per source controlled branch, you're creating a project per source controlled repository, and Jenkins creates subprojects automatically for you, one for each branch. The next level up is the organization. So some development teams are not just working on one repository, they're actually working on a large set of repositories that often all have some sort of similar structure. So we see this especially with people using microservices architecture, where they have many dozens, possibly hundreds of different services that are all kept in their own version control systems, but you want to apply a sort of a consistent build methodology to all of them. So we're creating a system called organization folders. So whereas before you would need to, again, resort to custom scripting in order to create projects for each of the repositories in a whole organization, now we're creating a simpler to use feature, which is a special kind of folder that appears in Jenkins called an organization. So each item in organization is itself a multi-branch workflow project. And it automatically stays in sync with with the list of projects in your organization. So it knows what's available and creates projects to build those automatically. And here, the only configuration in Jenkins is the name of the organization and your credentials to access it. So this is really keeping as much code as we possibly can, as much configuration as we possibly can in your code in GitHub rather than in Jenkins. There are different kinds of organizations that can be supported. So what we're building today and I'm demonstrating is a GitHub integration. So you can configure it with an organization or a user. And this also can support private repositories, and we're looking at GitHub Enterprise support as well. And CloudBees may also offer very similar features for BitBucket teams, I believe they're called, and stash projects. So those would be coming up. So I'd like to switch to a demo view and take a look at what you can do in Jenkins. So I've pre-configured this Jenkins instance. Okay. Really, it's not logged in. Okay, hold on just a moment. There we go. So I've pre-configured this Jenkins instance with credentials to access GitHub. So here I've just said what my GitHub username is, jglick, and then the password here is not actually my GitHub password, but I asked GitHub for an access token. So it's just something you can get on your administration screen for your account. And then all I need to do is pick a name, and I'm going to say GitHub organization. So you can see this is a new kind of top-level item that appears in Jenkins. And when I select that, all I need to fill out is the name of the GitHub organization. In this case, it's going to be CloudBees. So this is our test account for demos for CloudBees. And I'm just going to select my GitHub access token. So if I save that, we can go to check on the progress. And what it's doing now is it's going through all of the repositories that are in this organization, and it's checking to see if any of them have a file called Jenkinsfile in them. So in most cases they don't, but in a few cases they will find some Jenkins files. So that means that they're ready to be built by Workflow. So I'm going to go to this project called Multibranch demo, or I should say, so this is the organization folder view where you can see all of the different repositories that are available. And here's a particular repository, which is called Multibranch demo. So here's my repository on GitHub. And you can see that it does have a Jenkins file in it. Okay, a little bit larger. So underneath Multibranch demo, currently we only have one project. So again, this is a special kind of folder. And we only have one project master. So this is the Git master branch or trunk. You can see that it already went ahead and automatically ran build number 1 for this branch for us. So if you want to, you can take a look at the output from this build. So it went and cloned our repository from GitHub. It used my access token to authenticate to GitHub. In this case, it was a public repository, so it didn't matter. And then I'm running various build steps. So, so first of all, I get the source code, and then Jenkins is starting up a new Docker container, which is based on an image called Golang, which is an image designed for the Go language. So it's a language runtime with various tools. And we inside that container, we run a command Go version, and it's saying, yes, this is in fact Go version 1.5 running on Linux. And then I run some commands inside it. And once I'm done with that, I destroy the container. So my temporary build environment has been thrown away. And then I'm just, in lieu of real testing, I'm just running the executable that resulted from this. And you can see that yes, when I run this program that I just compiled, it can run. So let's take a look at the workflow script that was based on this, the Jenkins file. So actually, you see that there's nothing that looks like a program in here. So that's intentional. This is designed to look more like a configuration file than a program. So all we're saying is do a standard build for my site, whatever that turns out to be. And the Docker environment that we want to use is Go language version 150. And then we have a multi-line attribute here in the main script. These are things I want to run inside that container. And then PostScript, some other build steps that I want to run after that's done to run some tests. So this is all pretty simple stuff here. And so inside our repository, we just have our actual Go program sources here and the Jenkins file that gives some basic information about the environment we should be running and how it should be launched. If you go to look at the definition of this DSL, so this is something that was saved onto my Jenkins instance inside the workflow libs repository. I put it inside the vars directory, so it shows up as a global variable or function. And by calling this standard build, I tied it into this keyword in the Jenkins file. So here I just have a call method to make this be treated as a function with a body. Basically, all of this part is just Groovy boilerplate for setting up the builder pattern. And then the rest of this is workflow steps, workflow code. So we're saying set up a stage for the source control checkout. So these stage names appear here in the UI automatically when you run it. We're going to check out the source control corresponding to this version of the Jenkins file. And then the main stage, I'm just going to load up the environment and start up a Docker container with it and run my main script. And the post stage, I'm going to run the post script. So that's about it. So this is a fairly generic definition of how to do a build on my system that has these 3 stages and uses Docker in the middle stage. So let's say I wanted, as a developer of this project, I wanted to make some changes to it. So I would go and edit my source code and/or my Jenkins file, and then file a pull request. So here's a pull request that I've previously prepared. So what I'm doing here is that I'm renaming my source file. So I'm just taking out the dash in the middle of it and changing the output a little bit. And in the same commit, I'm also changing my Jenkins file. So I'm changing the definition of how Jenkins should build it a little bit to correspond with that source control change. So if I reopen pull request, this is basically the same as filing a new pull request as far as Jenkins is concerned. Or if you push new commits to an existing pull request, that also works. So if I say reopen pull request, then Jenkins is going to say that this commit is being built. So this status is being sent to GitHub. So right in your pull request, you can see what's going on. And if I open up that link, it's going to send me to, I forgot to set the Jenkins root URL, I'm sorry. But if I configured that right, it would have sent me to this page, which is a build of my project. So if you go up to Multibranch demo, you see that's automatically created a new subproject for this pull request. and it's automatically built in. And so if you look at the console output, you can see that not only did it pick up the source control changes that we had to our program source, so it's renamed it to Hello World without a hyphen here, but the Jenkins command, the Jenkins file has also been changed in this pull request. So Jenkins also knows to use corresponding build commands. Another thing that you might want to do is here. And finally, if you go back to the pull request, at the end of the build, if the build passed, then Jenkins is going to say it's OK. And so it'll give a little check mark, and that will show up in your list of pull requests. You can see that Jenkins says it looks good. If your build failed or had some test failures, then an X is going to appear here, so people know that your pull request is not ready for merge yet. That still needs some more work. Another thing that we might want to do is change the environment that's built in. So say I decided that Go version 1.5 is actually a little bit too new, and I actually want to build and test my project using Go 1.4.2, a somewhat earlier release. So I don't need to make any changes to Jenkins at all. All I did was find where it said 1.5.0 and change it to 1.4.2 in my project source control, commit that to a new branch, and file a pull request. And if we reopen this one so it starts building, then you see it's scheduled to be built, and now it's actually being built. So Jenkins created a subproject for it, it scheduled that, and now it's actively building it. And now you can see that it is running Docker run with Go environment 1.4.2. So it's picking up a different language runtime now. And this turned out to be OK as well. So now GitHub says, yes, that's also. So this way you can easily keep track of different kinds of changes that you're making and see whether they work or not. So if version 1.4.2 didn't work for various reasons, maybe your program didn't compile in that environment, no problem. You just see an X in this pull request. Other pull requests in the master branch are left untouched. So there's no risk of contaminating your system by making a change to some part of it. You can always play with your changes locally. So that's about it for a demo. I'd like to switch back to the slides and talk about what's out there now and what's coming up soon. So currently available on Regular Update Center is all of the integrations to get Subversion and Mercurial generally for multi-branch support. The ability to create the custom DSLs, like that standard build I mentioned, that's in Workflow version 1.10. And the Docker integration is released under the name CloudBees Docker Workflow plugin. In italics, I'm also listing some related Jenkins plugins that can work with the multi-branch system, but are not workflow-based. So there is a plugin called Multibranch plugin that offers a traditional UI-based configuration similar to a freestyle project in Jenkins. So you can use that to build separate branches. The downside is that you have no way of keeping your job definition as part of your source code, and you can't change it per branch. The multi-branch integration for workflow is currently on the Experimental Update Center. We'll be promoting that to the regular one once some dependencies are cleaned up. And there are also a couple of other plugins out there that have declarative multi-branch integrations. Literate plugin allows you to specify build steps in something that looks more like a README file. And YAML Project plugin allows you to give different kinds of build steps in YAML configuration file. So those also have the benefit of picking up definition from source control, although they don't have some of the flexibility of workflow and the ability to have long-running builds and things like this. Things that we've been working on recently that we're looking to release shortly would be the whole organization folder system and ability to create subprojects based on any repository with a Jenkins file, and the GitHub integration for that. And for CloudBees customers, we'll also be releasing previews of the support for GitHub pull requests and custom status notification, and also integration with BitBucket, very similar to GitHub. So a few things that we're also thinking about doing in the future. First of all, there's some cleanup we want to do before we are comfortable calling this whole system a 1.0. So there are various UI improvements that are needed, and there's a number of minor features that I sort of glossed over during the demo that we want to add. Possible things we might do include having smoother setup for GitHub. So currently, you needed to create an access token manually and set up a webhook in GitHub manually, which I didn't show as part of the demo. I had that set up previously. We'd like to have that just be driven from a simple UI wizard so that you just tell Jenkins, hey, please connect to GitHub. It would redirect you to GitHub. You'd log in, and then Jenkins would say, please give me access to set up webhooks and do everything I need to do. Another idea that's been brought up is to be able to build any repository that has certain other kinds of well-known marker files. Like if you find a Rakefile, then you can guess that this is a Ruby project that you want to build with Rake. So in that case, you wouldn't even need to have a Jenkins file with any workflow stuff in it at all. The Jenkins site would just set up a definition that says anytime you see a repository that has a Rake file in it, just run the following workflow script that's very generic that checks out sources and runs Rake. Or if it has a pom.xml, you should check out sources, run Maven, clean verify, and publish test results, something like that. Another little detail that we didn't really see here was that although the Jenkins file lets you specify all of your build steps and your publishers and all of these things, it would also be useful to be able to specify different general job properties. So a list of parameters if you want to trigger a build with parameters, how Jenkins behaves if you try to run multiple builds concurrently, then possibly other things like this. Triggers, how the job should be triggered, if not by source control changes, etc. And finally, for the case of pull requests, specifically pull requests coming from forks of the repository, so potentially by unknown people on the internet, you'd like to have a simple way of restricting those to not run any potentially dangerous build steps. So you probably don't want general pull requests being able to write their own custom Jenkins file. You'd want to use a stock Jenkins file and have it maybe go into some sort of special defensive mode. And you don't want to deploy anything that's produced there to a staging server, et cetera. You just want to run basic build steps and tests. So that's what I have for slides. I'd like to open it up for questions in case people have some questions they'd like to ask, or I can do additional demos of things related to the system. Right, I do see a question in the log that is asking about stash integration. So this is something that we'd be looking at doing. We haven't defined exactly what would go into this, but it'd probably be very similar to GitHub integration. So support for stash projects or lists of repositories, authentication, webhooks, and that sort of thing. Yeah. All right, so somebody is asking, does Workflow allow a multi-node build like for matrix jobs? Yeah, this is a very good question. So you can run Workflow builds on multiple nodes. You can, let me go back to a, definition of a workflow script here. So whenever you run a node block in Workflow, that's a signal to Jenkins that you should please allocate a new and start running any of the contained build steps on that slave. You can do this multiple times during a single workflow build, and you can use a special step called parallel to do things in parallel so that you can divide up your build into different parts, each of which runs on a different slave. And as part of node, you can also specify a label that should run on. So you can say that certain build steps should run on Linux, others should run on Windows. You can run them in parallel. There's even a plugin called the Parallel Test Executor plugin that lets you take a set of tests, unit tests, or functional, et cetera, and automatically divide them across a large pool of build slaves so that you get pretty close to linear speed up on a large test suite according to the hardware you have. So somebody is asking, is it possible to write a Groovy script to pop up a message box or some other way of interactive UI component on the browser screen? Yes, yes it is. I actually had a sample pull request which maybe showed some of these things here. So here's an example of adding a parallel step which runs different things on two different slaves. I'm also using a retry step to try running something several times. If it fails the first 4 times, it restarts. So you can have different kinds of logic like this in your script. You can have if-then statements and loops and everything like that. And then to address your question, there's for user input. And you can, if you just write it like this with only a message, it's just a OK cancel type of prompt. But you can also ask for parameters so that people can type in a string or check some boxes or select some hold downs or whatever to give information that goes back to the script. So actually, if I, sorry. So you can try doing something like this. So I'll actually show what you can do. So let me see if I can edit it. So here I'm editing my workflow script. And I'm saying, are you ready to deploy? So I'll make a new commit with this. Just check my changes. Great. Start a new branch. Yes. We propose a file change and create a pull request based on it. All right, so I've now created a new pull request, and it says, here we can see Jenkins is already building this. So in this case, although this was a pull request, it was created from a branch in the main repository rather than a fork. And so the multi-branch system just treats it as a regular branch build rather than especially as a pull request. But it will it'll do all of the build steps I did before, but here at the end it will ask me for confirmation. So you can see also here it gives me a little prompt, do I want to deploy or not? I say, yes, proceed. And then it should finish. So you see it said it was approved by the administrator, and now it's done. So if you go back to the pull request, you see that, yes, Jenkins approved that. Back to the question for multi-node builds, you can run build steps on multiple machines. One thing that we haven't yet built is the ability to visualize the results across different machines in a matrix system, the way the matrix job does. So basically, you can do all of the build steps, but the result is going to be something more like a pass-fail. Whereas what we would like is to show a matrix, one x-axis showing platform, y-axis showing tool version, and each cell of the matrix showing the status for that particular combination. So that's something we're looking at for the future. So let's see if we have some more questions. Someone is asking whether if I have a large organization with hundreds of projects, can I group them somehow by team? So let's close this. So currently, the organization folder just shows a flat list of all of the repositories and some organization. There's the ability to create views, but probably what we should have is for it to automatically create a view every time the integration finds some kind of teams that's listed in GitHub. So we'd like to have that automatically appear as new tabs, perhaps, so that according to which teams you were in, you might see particular tabs corresponding to those teams. So that's something that's been thought about. Okay, so somebody's asking, each pull request will create a build, or are they going to pile up? So multi-branch in general does have a way of saying that you should discard old branches, and that would include pull requests. So you can say that I only want to keep branch projects for, say, 1 day after the last build, or 1 month. Or I only want to keep the last 1 or 2 branches after they've been deleted. So after a pull request is merged or otherwise closed, or after you have a topic branch in your repository and you close it out, you want to collect those unused branch projects. So that is supported by multi-branch in general. We haven't yet tied that into the organization folders to pre-configure that across the organization. That's something we plan to do. Somebody asking, is there an option in Jenkins to create sub-views inside a view? Yes, there is a nested view plugin. In this case, what I'm showing you here is more like folders rather than views. So we're not actually relying on views here at all. These are actually at distinct levels of the hierarchy. So you can see that Jenkins is referring to them with a folder-like path. But you can also add views to some of these, or there's some work that needs to be done to make that work right. All right, we had a question about logging in using GitHub. So basically the question is, instead of using Jenkins' own user database, can you pick up the authentication directly from GitHub? So there is actually a GitHub OAuth access control plugin, which provides a security realm for Jenkins that is based on GitHub rather than something else like LDAP. So if you went to configure security, it would be an option that would show up under security realm. It also adds an authorization strategy, so it provides a particular policy of access control that's also based on GitHub. That doesn't yet work with Multibranch and Workflow, but I think it could be fixed to work with that. So the idea would be that if in GitHub you have access to the CloudBees organization and you're in a team that can clone from but not push to Multibranch demo, then you would get a certain set of permissions on this project in Jenkins. So that way you wouldn't have to duplicate access control between your GitHub account and Jenkins. So that's to be seen how well that works. Okay, I'm looking for any other questions. I'm not seeing any now. So if you have any questions, send them now. Otherwise, I think we're done.
All right, it looks like that is everything for today.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you to Jesse for speaking, and we will have the recording to you soon. So thank you for joining us today.